Well, it's been a pretty busy week, but I'm here now. Your host, JD, is back. Episode 10. A real milestone. So, in today's episode, I'm going to look at all the television shows that I've watched growing up in the last 40 years. And while television hasn't been an altogether significant part of my life, there certainly has been enough of it to warrant a full episode. First, a few side notes. I will not talk about any made for TV movies, as I will make another video just devoted to full movies. I'm only talking about episodic shows, whether they were daily or weekly. Also, I'm only going to talk about shows that I was at least moderately invested in. So I won't include any shows that I only caught an episode or two, or those shows which were on but I wasn't altogether paying that much attention to. Lastly, I will not talk about any Japanese anime in this episode, with one exception. If I did, this episode would be twice as long. That is a topic that deserves its own video. So let's get to it. First, my childhood. As I mentioned before, I only have vague memories before age 3. I might have watched early childhood television programming prior to that, like Sesame Street and the cardigan-wearing host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. That show seems to have been on forever. But from what I remember, there were a lot of cartoons, and I mean a lot of cartoons. The 80s were an amazing time for children to be growing up. Television wasn't yet ruined by parents' groups by that point, so imaginations were allowed to run rampant. It was also a time before the abominations of today's computer-generated cartoons. These were real cartoons. I realize now that the cartoons were a marketing ploy to sell toys, but at that time, I neither considered nor cared about it. Besides He-Man and GoBots, I didn't really collect a lot of TV-themed toys. Back then, cartoons took up a sizable portion of Saturday mornings and ran on all the major networks: CBS, NBC, ABC, and WPIX. This was family time. There was also a segment on USA called Cartoon Express that basically reran most cartoons that had been shown on major networks, and that was also on weekend afternoons. So we'll start with the earliest cartoon I remember: He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I remember watching this with my playmate Paul, whom my mother babysat for when I was really young. We also had action figures and acted out what we saw. Then there were also cartoons like The Herculoids, Thundar the Barbarian, and The Littles. As I got a little older, I began to relish the Saturday morning block. There was Pac-Man, probably the oldest video game cartoon I watched, although I do not really like the Pac-Man video game. Then G.I. Joe and Pole Position, another video game related show. I remember watching Fraggle Rock infrequently, even though it was a live-action Muppet show, not a cartoon. Oh, also, Muppet Babies, Snorks, and Turbo Teen, a cartoon about a guy who could change into a car. Then came Challenge of the GoBots, which ushered in my interest in robotics. It was around this time that I also started watching the live-action family sitcom Small Wonder, another robot-centric show. This was around 1985. Then came The Wuzzles, Thundercats, and Teen Wolf. Also the live-action Pee-wee's Playhouse, about a strange dude who lives in a living house with Muppets. And Alf, about an alien creature that comes to live with a suburban family. Next came high-action shows like Bionic 6, Cops, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was highly addicted to TMNT and even dressed as a Ninja Turtle on one Halloween. Another live-action family sitcom, Out of This World, started around this time, which was another good family show about a girl whose father is an alien, so she has some superpowers. That's when dinosaur shows started becoming more prevalent. First in 1987 there was Dinosaurs. Then in 1988, Denver, The Last Dinosaur. A few years later, the live-action shows, Dinosaurs and Land of the Lost started showing, but I already talked about all these in my Dinosaurs episode. So there was clearly a great deal of cartoon action in the early and mid-80s, on Saturday and even Sunday mornings. There was another live-action kids show, You Can't Do That on Television, which I sometimes watched on weekday or weekend afternoons. There were other interesting Nickelodeon kids shows like the Messy Kids Game Show, Double Dare, and the science program, Mr. Wizard's World, which prompted my interest in science and technology with such interesting topics like a Mobius strip and how long is a piece of paper. Sometimes on weekend afternoons I watched Charles in Charge, a live-action sitcom about a young man who babysits for a family. On weekday afternoons I caught a cartoon block referred to as the Disney Afternoon, which, as one would expect, was all Disney properties. This I started watching roughly when I started elementary school. The first of those I started watching was DuckTales. There was The Adventures of the Gummy Bears earlier than that, but I never got home early enough to catch it. After DuckTales came Chippendales Rescue Rangers, which was my favorite show of that block. Then Tailspin, which I didn't really care for all that much. And finally, Darkwing Duck. I loved Darkwing Duck. It was my second favorite of that block. But sadly, that was about the time I was becoming a teen, so I wouldn't be watching those shows much longer. I did watch a little Bonkers, and even a few episodes of Gargoyles, but I'm getting ahead of myself. During our dinner, we also watched a lot of family-oriented television. First, there was The Hogan Family. I actually really liked this show. Sometimes we also watched Growing Pains or Family Ties, but the biggest primetime family show was, of course, Full House. I think we watched that as a family during dinner from its inception to its conclusion. I usually didn't watch television after dinner, but instead did my homework or played video games or used the computer. Sometimes, as a family, we watched America's Funniest Home Videos and America's Funniest People. There was a block on Fridays called TGIF that showed a lot of sitcoms like Family Matters and Step by Step. By the end of the 80s and the early 1990s, television themes changed course. This was the time of video game themed shows. This began with shows like the Super Mario Bros. Super Show and Captain N, the Game Master. Then came the adventures of Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World. When I was young, I thought they were all just segments of the same exact show. The only thing I remember from the Super Mario Bros. Super Show was that Nicole Eggert from Charles in Charge made a guest appearance. Later on, Sonic the Hedgehog had its own cartoon, even though I wasn't a fan of the series. There were other strange and interesting shows like Beetlejuice, Camp Candy, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa. Then came the epic cartoon adventure, Mega Man. I was a huge fan of the series, so that show was one of my favorites. Next to Final Fantasy, I think Mega Man was my second favorite video game franchise. Lastly, Mortal Kombat, Defenders of the Realm, hit the airwaves, and while this was critically panned, I actually enjoyed watching it. But that was a time when Saturday morning television took a turn for the worse. In the evenings, we would watch Home Improvement, and sometimes Unhappily Ever After. Nikki Cox was my dream girl. Keep in mind I was a teenager by this point, so I started steering away from cartoons. Sometimes I watched Saved by the Bell in the afternoons, and later on, Blossom. So by 1995, television irrevocably changed. This is in part thanks to whiny parents groups and their issues with cartoon violence. So all the goodness that was the 80s and early 90s ended. But we were given the Sci-Fi Channel in exchange. In 1994, Reboot was the first computer-generated cartoon I watched. But in 1995, everything changed, as I mentioned in my Japan video. I first found the Japanese cartoon, Sailor Moon, which I began watching the following year. This, along with Sci-Fi's Saturday anime, completely changed my television watching habits. Also in 95, I began watching Captain Planet and the Planeteers, ushering in my interest in environmentalism and also Eastern European women. Saturday evenings were filled with episodes of Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, Xena, Warrior Princess, and The Adventures of Sinbad. I usually watched these shows with my dad and younger brother while visiting him, so that was always an adventure. We also sometimes watched other science fiction shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000, a science fiction comedy show that satirizes science fiction B-movies. Also, Lex and Tripping the Rift. My father was a science fiction junkie. On weekend afternoons, I often watched Highlander, which got me interested in sword fighting, and its companion show, Renegade. Later on, I watched the Japanese samurai action show, Zatoichi, on the Independent Film Channel. Just before I started college, I started watching another sci-fi show with my mother and younger brother called Sliders, about a boy and his friends who, along with their professor, created a device that allows them to teleport into alternate realities. This really interested me, as I would have loved to be able to see different possibilities of what the future could have been like. It also involved a lot of math, which I was also getting more interested in at that time, and, along with Jurassic Park, helped me to decide my academic major for college. So basically, everything that happened to me as a result of my university experience is because of television. I would have loved an alternate reality that ended a little more pleasantly. Then, in '98, I started college and pretty much stopped watching TV. But I did watch Dawson's Creek to lighten my mood. I also started watching X-Play on G4 Tech TV, a show devoted to video games. I also watched Whose Line Is It Anyway, an improv comedy show on Comedy Central, and the Robot Carnage show BattleBots on the Sci-Fi Channel. I also watched a lot of anime at this time, even after I graduated from college. I also enjoyed another cartoon, Code Yoko, half computer generated and half cel animated, which brings me to modern times. Well, I watched the internet series Ruby, RWBY, by Monty and Rooster Teeth. And there you have it, my television history and its influence in my life. Well, I'm sure there are many, many more shows that influenced me, but I can't remember them, and these seem to be my greatest influences. If any of these shows suit your fancy, give them a watch, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you are so inclined, please feel free to donate to my Patreon, link in the description. Thanks again for sharing in my experience. I look forward to seeing you all next time.